He was a serial killer who bragged about killing people, and he professed and confessed to be a demon.
He was that, bruh. If he wanted you out of there, he'll go do it himself on feet by himself.
Vaughn gave me a lot of passes. He could have killed me a couple times.
I was happy as hell when I found out Vaughn was dead. I cooked for the whole day.
I was relieved for the community, man, because he was over there torturing them guys, man. I ain't gonna.
This is the story of Walter "Silk" Bennett, a man whose reputation on the streets of Chicago was so feared that nearly 20 years after his death, the details of his life remain wrapped in mystery. Silk was King Von's father, and according to those who knew both men, he carried an even more dangerous reputation than his son would eventually build. What makes this story different from everything you've heard before is what happens when you actually dig into the records. When you try to verify the legends, you run into something unexpected. The man behind the mythology barely exists in any official documentation, with no court records, no news coverage of his death, and no police reports that have surfaced publicly. What remains is a handful of verified facts, King Von's own words about his father, and street lore that may or may not hold any truth. Today, we're going to separate fact from fiction and tell you what we actually know about Silk, what King Von himself said about the man who raised him, and we're going to be straight about where the verified information stops and the mythology picks up. Understanding that line is what makes this story hit harder, not softer. Let's start with what we can actually confirm about Walter Edward Bennett. Born on October 28, 1974 in Chicago's Cook County, Silk lived 30 years before his death on July 31, 2005. These dates come from the Social Security Death Index and a Find a Grave memorial that explicitly names him as the father of the late rapper King Von. That same memorial confirms something else that matters, which is that Silk was cremated and left no gravestone behind. Any photos floating around online claiming to show Silk's grave aren't accurate. His street name was Silk, extended sometimes to Ada Park Silk, and that reference points to the Ada neighborhood, also called Sawyer Garrett Park, in the Morgan Park community area of Chicago's South Side. This location sits completely separate from Parkway Gardens and Greater Grand Crossing, the area known as O Block where King Von grew up. Silk wasn't from O Block at all, and his roots trace back to Ada Park instead. Ada Park operates as a recognized Black Disciples faction, and this is where some online sources get the details twisted. Silk ran with the Black Disciples, not the Gangster Disciples, and those two organizations carry different histories and different structures. King Von's mother was Natasha Chambers, known as Tasha, and she raised Von mostly on her own because Silk spent so much of his time locked up. Wikipedia's well-sourced entry on King Von confirms that Silk fathered at least 6 children, giving Von half-siblings that include Kayla B., the social media personality many viewers already recognize, along with Young Bogo, Sky, and Louis V. The relationship between Tasha and Silk was rocky from the start, with sources indicating frequent clashes over his absence from the family. One detail stands out more than almost anything else in this entire story, and it puts everything into a different light. King Von first met his father around age 8, somewhere around 2002, and that's when their relationship actually began. Von only knew his father for about 3 years before Silk was killed, which means the man whose legacy shaped everything about King Von's identity was barely in his life at all. Von came into the world on August 9, 1994, and his father took his last breath on July 31, 2005, leaving Von at just 10 years old with his 11th birthday, only 9 days away. Wikipedia describes this relationship with careful language, noting that Von's connection to his father stayed inconsistent because of all those incarcerations, and that when Von turned 11, his father was killed by an unseen gunman. 3 years together, that's all they had. And yet Silk's influence on Von shaped everything about who he became. And we know this because of what Von said himself. The single most valuable primary source about who Silk actually was comes straight from King Von's Instagram, where he posted a tribute that the Netline captured. Von called his father the definition of real and wrote that Silk taught him everything when it came to the street life, from choosing your circle wisely to the most important lesson of all, which was loyalty. Von referred to Silk as Ada Park's finest and wrote that when it comes to being a real, loyal, stand-up person, Silk set the standard. The post ended with Von saying he missed his father and that the streets and his kids miss him too, followed by the line that Chicago hasn't been the same since Silk left and never will be. Those are Von's own words, laying out exactly what Silk meant to him, and they paint a picture of street wisdom, careful selection of associates, and loyalty that ran deeper than anything else. The most direct musical tribute to Silk shows up in the Exposing Me remix that Von recorded with Memo 600 in January 2019, where he raps about resting in peace to Silk from Ada Park and calls him the older version of himself. That line carries weight because Von doesn't just honor his father. He frames Silk as an earlier edition of who Von would grow into, the older me. That's how Von understood his own identity, not as someone carrying on a memory, but as a direct continuation of his father's existence. Discussion has circulated online about a deleted verse from Von's track Where I'm From, which landed on his posthumous album, What It Means to Be King, in 2022. Multiple TikTok accounts referenced this unreleased verse and claimed Von broke down crying during the session and couldn't finish recording. But the content of that verse remains unknown, and the released version doesn't directly mention Silk. That part of the story stays unverified. A rumor has bounced around online for years claiming King Von shared blood with David Barksdale, the founder of the Black Disciples, and this connects to the nickname grandson that Von carried. Von himself cleared up where that name actually came from during an interview with 16-shot EM visuals in October 2018. While locked up, older inmates started calling him grandson because something about him reminded them of King David. And these were men who had walked the same streets when Barksdale was still alive. They recognized qualities in Von that echoed the founder himself. What this reveals about Silk's legacy matters here. Older Black disciples saw in Von the same characteristics that made Silk's reputation, but the connection came from character recognition rather than bloodline. And here's the thing that makes any blood connection to David Barksdale fall apart completely. Barksdale died in September 1974, and Silk was born in October 1974, the exact same year. For Von to be Barksdale's grandson, Silk would need to be Barksdale's son, and the timing makes that impossible. The math doesn't add up no matter how you run the numbers. This is the section where verified facts thin out and street lore starts filling in the gaps. July 31st, 2005 marks the day Walter Silk Bennett was killed in Chicago at 30 years old, and Wikipedia uses deliberately careful phrasing, describing him as killed by an unseen gunman. The netline cites King Von's uncle as the source for more detail, claiming Silk took a gunshot wound from a sniper working for a rival gang. Beyond that account, nothing surfaces in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, or any local news outlet. No police reports or court filings related to the homicide exist in any public database. No killer has ever been publicly named, and the case appears to have gone cold without resolution. Two narratives float around social media about how Silk died, and neither one can be verified through any official channel. The sniper story goes like this. Silk was shot by a sniper outside a skating rink because his street reputation made it impossible for anyone to approach him directly, forcing whoever wanted him dead to use a long-range shooter. Some versions claim he survived the initial shot, but died on the operating table roughly 2 days later, and certain accounts point the finger at the gangster disciples. The second narrative frames Silk's death as payback from a drug dispute, with the story being that he took a large quantity of product from someone who then came looking for revenge. What stands out is the complete absence of news coverage. Chicago logged over 450 homicides in 2005, and plenty of individual shootings never made the papers. But a street legend getting taken out by a sniper would typically draw at least a brief mention somewhere. The fact that no coverage exists anywhere raises real questions about whether the more dramatic versions of this story hold any truth. Let's address what we don't actually know, because this gap matters for understanding the full Silk story. No specific charges, convictions, case numbers, or prison records connected to Silk turned up in any public database search. Multiple sources repeat that he spent most of his life moving in and out of prison, and Von, not meeting him until age 8, supports that pattern. But the specifics of what Silk caught charges for, where he served time, and how long he sat behind bars remain completely undocumented in any record that can be accessed. Claims floating around that he ranked among the richest and most powerful figures in Ada Park, or that he ran a major drug operation, trace back to fan-made YouTube documentaries and content aggregator websites rather than any source that can be verified. No confirmed body count or specific violent acts attributed to Silk exist in any credible reporting anywhere. The title of this video frames Silk as more dangerous than King Von, and that framing reflects street mythology and the way people who knew both men described the father. Documented facts and figures can't back it up. Does that absence of documentation prove the mythology wrong? Not at all. Chicago in the 1990s and early 2000s wasn't a place where street figures left behind paper trails. Records not existing, doesn't mean Silk wasn't everything people say he was. What it does mean is that we have to draw a clear line between what can be proven and what we're accepting on faith from stories passed down through the years. A few sources exist where Silk's own family has spoken about him directly. King Von's uncle serves as the main source behind the sniper narrative, appearing in the Netlines reporting and showing up across TikTok content that discusses how Silk died. Tisha, King Von's mother, appears in a TikTok video discussing both Von and his father, and that clip has pulled in over 20,000 likes. No transcript of what she actually says has been published in text form anywhere. Quotes from Silk himself don't exist in any documented form. His death came in 2005, years before social media spread everywhere and YouTube became the archive it is now. No interviews, no recorded statements, no writings of any kind survived him. Everything known about this man comes from what other people have said. Days before his death, in November 2020, King Von sat down with Audiomack for what would become his final interview, and he talked about family and what loss had done to his. Von mentioned that his family stayed tight before his grandmother passed away, that they used to gather at her house, and that she was the one who kept everybody connected. A separate conversation with DJ Academics captured Von explaining the constant awareness he carried everywhere he went. His head had been on a swivel long before rap ever entered his life, and he asked whether that kind of hypervigilance just disappears when the money starts coming in. That mindset, that permanent state of watching every angle for threats, came from his environment and from his father's teaching. Silk passed down lessons about the streets, about loyalty, about never letting your guard drop. Von held on to those lessons all the way until the night gunfire took his life in Atlanta on November 6th, 2020. Strip away the mythology and focus on what can actually be verified, and you find what makes this story land so hard. A father who spent most of his years locked up finally meets his son when the boy turns 8. 3 years pass between them, and during those 3 years, the father transfers everything he knows, loyalty above all else. Watch who you let into your circle. Learn how the streets actually work. Gunfire takes the father when the son is 10 years old, just 9 days before his 11th birthday. That son grows up to become one of the most successful drill rappers Chicago has ever produced, and he builds his entire identity around his father's memory, calling Silk the older version of himself in his music, and carrying the man's reputation into every room he enters. 15 years after his father's death, that same son catches bullets in Atlanta. November 6, 2020. King Von was 26 years old. Silk made it to 30. Von only reached 26. Neither father nor son lived to see 35. The full truth about Walter Silk Bennett might stay buried forever. Documentation is thin, limited to his name, his dates, his Ada Park ties, his children, his cremation, and his death by gunfire. Nearly everything beyond those facts exists somewhere between oral history and mythology that nobody can verify. Maybe that fits who he was. Silk moved through a world that didn't keep records. Street figures in his era operated before social media turned every moment into content. The only reason anyone knows his name at all is because his son got famous and made sure that name would never be forgotten. What can be confirmed is this: King Von loved his father with everything he had. 3 years was all the time they shared, and those 3 years shaped every part of who Von became. Von called Silk the definition of real, and wrote that his father taught him about loyalty, about choosing the right people, about how to survive in the streets. Von saw himself as his father's continuation, the older me brought forward into a new generation. Whether Silk's reputation is more dangerous than King Von holds literal truth, or whether it's the kind of legend that expands with every retelling, nobody can say for certain. What can be said is that King Von believed it completely, and he spent his entire career pushing himself to measure up. The streets of Chicago haven't been the same since Silk left. Von wrote those words himself. 15 years later, when Von caught those bullets in Atlanta, the same statement applied to him. 2 generations, same story, same ending. If you made it this far, drop a comment letting me know what you think about the Silk story. And if there are other Chicago figures you want researched with facts separated from mythology, put those names in the comments too. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll catch you in the next one.